So we're on page K, and we're up to Hanochri on the right side. Nechluku Tanoim im Kodshe Hanochrim Osim Tmura. Now, once again, we could have many different scenarios that would come under this issue. You could talk about the Nochri who's being mamir his own carbon onto his own behemas chum. You can talk about a Yisrael being mamir from a Nochri's behemas Kodshim onto the Yisrael's behemas chum. You could even talk about a case where the Yisrael owns the behemas Kodshim and the Nochri does the Maisa Tmura with Rishus, with license, onto either the Yisrael's behemas chulin or the Goy's behemas chulin. There's so many different permutations we could talk about. So right now we just have a general introduction here, and he says in the footnote that this is the sugya in Tmura on Daf Beis Amid Beis. Am I correct?
Right.
Okay. Fine. La locha. How do we paskin? Quotes the Ram in Hilchos Tmura. Einam osim Tmura. So Kodshim Nochrim does not create Tmura. L'shitas HaRambam lo nechluku ela im chala hatmura midoraisa. Ach midrabonu l'divri hakol hari zu Tmura. The Rambam Shita, we don't know if anyone disagrees with the Rambam right now, but all agree that even Anoim who say that there's no Tmura in Kodshim Nochrim, that's only on a Deraisa level, but on a Drabana level, we do recognize the Tmura. Which I don't exactly know what that means, that Midrabanan Harezu Tmura. So now let's go through some of the various scenarios. Number one, Hifrish Anochri Karbon L'Skaperbo Nochri. So this was a carbon that a guy was mafresh for a guy. I assume for himself, but it could be for another guy. The Hemira Hanochri, and the Maisa Tmura was implemented by a guy. So everything here seems to be done by a guy, meaning the carbon itself was a carbon shal guy, the mamir was a guy, and no one else has any ownership rights in this behemas kodshim except for the Nochri. Because the kapara was for a Nochri. Meaning you could have a case where the Nochri was mafresh a carbon on behalf of a kapara of Yisrael. But that's not the case we're dealing with, at least not at this point. So on this we have the machlokas tanoim as to whether or not the Nochri could implement a valid Maisa Tmura on his own behemas Kodshim. And we said that even though, according to one Tana, which Rambam Paskins like that Tana, that there is no Tmura, but nevertheless that's only on a Doraisa level, but Rabbanan, there would be Tmura. Next, Hifrish Anochri Karbon L'Skaper Bo Yisrael. So the very magnanimous guy who is now being mafresh a carbon on behalf of a Yisrael. Now, in the past, we've said that the bailim for Maisa Tmura is the bailim HaMiskaper. So we might say in this case, everybody would agree that the Tmura is a valid Tmura because it's the Yisrael who is considered, quote unquote, the bialim of this carbon. But the only problem is that who did the Maisa Tamura? And it should depend. If the guy did the Maisa Tamura, then that's invalid. But if the Yisrael would do the Maisa Tamura, since he's considered the bialim because the hafrasha was done for his kapara, that should be a valid Tamura. However, he mira nachri. So let's stop here. If the nachri did the Maisa Tamura on a behemoth that the bailus lekapara is that of Israel, then according to one Tan at least, it should be a valid Maisa Tamura. The guy is capable of a Maisa Tamura. The only problem is that we have to add another element into the equation. If the Bailam HaMiskaprim is Israel, then the Maisa Tamura of anybody, even another Israel, would be invalid. Unless he got Rishus, that's why he adds these words, Rishus Yisrael HaMiskaprim. So the Israel as a miskaper is the quasi-bailim of this carbon, such that if anyone wants to do a Maisa Tamura on this carbon, he's got to get, he's got to get approval for that Maisa Tamura. But in this case, it's a little bit complicated because the Maisa Tamura was being implemented by the guy himself, albeit Bershus Yisrael. So is the guy a shliach, so to speak, to implement a Tamura on behalf of Israel, A, because he got permission to do so from Israel, who's the Bailam HaMiskaprim, and B, because technically he owns the animal. It's his animal. Is nechliku bazer rishon, and they fall into three different groups. Yesh Sovrim, one group of Rishonim holds, shebazer nistapka hagimara im lidivrei hakol yachol lahamid, o shegam ofen zeh shoni b'machlokes tanoim. The Gemara has a suffix in a case of Goy HaMemer Behema, and these Rishonim understood that the suffix of the Gemara was in a case where the Israel gave the guy permission to be maimed. And